The Gospel of Mark is the first of the four Gospels, is the earliest of the four Gospels. And I want to spend a little bit of time just kind of running through some of the highlights of the Gospel of Mark. So most likely the Gospel of Mark was written during Emperor Nero's persecution. So maybe somewhere between 65 and 70 or so CE. There are some little hints at this in the Gospel of Mark. And so if we look at Mark chapter 8, verses 34 and 38, we read this. He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it." It's talking a little bit about the coming of Christ. It's talking a little bit about this idea of imminent death. Discipleship in the Gospel of Mark equals suffering. We see that with Jesus. We see that even in the verses I just read. This notion that if you are going to be a disciple of Jesus, then you must be willing to suffer for it, to give up your life, to put yourself last, to put others first. I've already spoken a little bit about the "and immediately" that we see in the Gospel of Mark. And that might be a literary device, but I think it also hints at the impending doom of Jerusalem. The Gospel of Mark was written mostly in Palestine, probably in Rome, although that's the traditional view that it was written in Rome. Its emphasis clearly is on this Jewish revolt, which ended up in the Romans coming back then and destroying the temple. And then we have what's called the little apocalypse in Mark 13, which talks about a tribulation that then leads to the end times. And if we look at Mark chapter 13 and read maybe just a little bit, it says, "As for yourselves, beware, for they will hand you over to councils, and you will be beaten in synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings because of me as a testimony to them. And the good news must first be proclaimed to all nations. When they bring you to trial and hand you over, do not worry beforehand about what you are to say, but say whatever is given you at the time, for it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit." And then it talks a little bit about betrayals. And so we have this kind of, war before the end times, before the peace of the end times. And that's what we see in that little apocalypse in Mark. Here's a basic outline. So the first part of the Gospel of Mark gives us a little bit of a prelude to Jesus' ministry. In the first chapter of Mark, we have Jesus' baptism by John the Baptist, and then we get Jesus being tempted in the wilderness, also in the Gospel, or in the first chapter of Mark. Then most of the Gospel of Mark is taken up with Jesus' ministry in Galilee. He travels from place to place. He does all the things he does in the other Gospels. He heals people, he teaches, he performs miracles, and he goes from place to place gathering a following. At the end of the Gospel of Mark, he makes a journey into Jerusalem, which is typical of the synoptics. Then in Jerusalem, he's got some ministry there where he does, again, healing, teaching, preaching, and going from place to place, meeting people, gathering followers. And then that's also where Jesus is crucified, right outside of Jerusalem. And the end of the Gospel of Mark is Jesus' resurrection from the dead. And it is the empty tomb, the women at the empty tomb, and Jesus telling them to not say anything to anybody that Jesus has risen from the dead. Now, as I said before, in the Gospels, Jesus is portrayed in different ways in each Gospel. So each Gospel presents a perspective on who Jesus is. So in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is presented as a suffering servant. I want to hit that one first. So in chapter 8, we see these words about Jesus. He asked them, "Who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. That's the messianic secret that I talked about. That's don't tell anybody who Jesus is, because it's a big secret that Jesus is the Messiah. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. So we know that Jesus is going to suffer. We know that Jesus is going to die. Jesus is also presented here as a healer, and this is true in all the Gospels. Okay? Jesus heals people. In the Gospel of Mark, he heals a leper. Jesus is controversial, probably more so in the Gospel of Luke than in Mark. But in Mark, Jesus takes on the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And if we read chapter 2, verses 15 to 17, it says this: "As he sat down at dinner in Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were also sitting with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. When the scribes of the Pharisees saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, they said to his disciples, 'Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?' When Jesus heard this, he said to them, 'Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners.'" So Jesus is controversial in the sense that he's hanging out with people that the Pharisees didn't think he should be hanging out with. He was hanging out with the untouchables, the ones who nobody wanted to hang out with because they were either morally corrupt, or they were prostitutes, or they were unclean in some way. And so Jesus, as a good Jew, probably shouldn't have been with these folks, but he was. And that, of course, makes him very controversial. Jesus is also called the Son of Man. He has a couple of names like this. So in Gospel of Mark, it's the Son of Man. But when we get to the Gospel of Matthew, that's the Son of God. And so basically they both mean the same thing, and that is that Jesus is God's Son. What is unique about the Gospel of Mark? It is the shortest Gospel. It only has 16 chapters. I've said a little bit about this messianic secret. Every time Jesus does something to reveal himself, to his disciples, he then tells them, "Don't tell anyone. Don't tell anyone who I am." I'm not sure exactly the reason for this within the gospel, other than maybe Jesus wasn't quite ready for people to know, in part because they wouldn't have understood. Keep in mind that in the Gospel of Mark, the disciples really never understand Jesus. They just never quite get it. And if his closest disciples couldn't get it, then it's possible nobody else could get it either. And so for right now, it was best just to kind of keep that all secret and let people come to understand Jesus on their own. And immediately, I'm going to skip over that part. I've said it a few times now. There's an urgency there about this gospel, probably pointing towards the end times. Jesus' immediate followers and his family are clueless. Let's jump to chapter 9 and look at that. Chapter 9, verses 9 and 10. As they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So they kept the matter to themselves, questioning what this rising from the dead could mean. Then they asked him, "Why do the scribes say that Elijah must come first?" He said to them, "Elijah is indeed coming first to restore all things. How then is it written about the Son of Man that he is to go through many sufferings and be treated with contempt? But I tell you that Elijah has come, and they did to him whatever they pleased, as it is written about him." So I don't think it's that the disciples and his family can't understand who Jesus is. I think that they're trying to understand who Jesus is, but maybe Jesus isn't quite ready to do the full reveal right now. Jesus wants that to happen later on after he's resurrected from the dead. Another thing that's unique about Mark is that he doesn't have any birth story at all. There's really no mention of Jesus' birth. He just sort of appears on the scene and begins to speak. And then he's baptized immediately by John the Baptist. And so if we go all the way back to chapter 1, the Gospel of Mark starts out with the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in the prophet Isaiah. And then in verse 4, John the Baptizer appeared in the wilderness, proclaiming a baptism of repentance and the forgiveness of sin. And then John the Baptist baptizes Jesus. So there's no birth story, there's no anything about Jesus' childhood, nothing. Jesus just shows up. And that's very different than particularly Matthew and Luke, but even John talks about Jesus being incarnated, Jesus being born, and coming into the world. But Mark has no such thing. Again, maybe another indication that Mark is the first gospel is because he just gets right to the point and all that urgency. The Gospel of Mark also has two endings. You might not see this on a Bible app on your phone, but if you look at a physical book Bible, you may be able to see it. And so, like my Bible has it laid out where in chapter 16, verse, it's kind of a verse between 8 and 9. It's not really numbered, but it's labeled the shorter ending of Mark. This is after Jesus had appeared to the disciples, and he said, all that had been commanded them, they told briefly to those around Peter. And afterward, Jesus himself sent out through them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. So the disciples had seen Jesus risen from the dead, and then he tells them to go out and tell other people. Well, the longer ending of the Gospel of Mark starts in verse 9 and goes through verse 20. So it adds about an additional 11 verses on there, and that's when Jesus goes to the women. He meets with the women, particularly Mary Magdalene, and then he appears to the 11 disciples, aside from Peter, and then he tells them to go out and proclaim the good news. So by that time then, he's ready for everybody to know who he is. So the Gospel of Mark then is unique in its own way, most likely the first gospel, and the shortest of the Gospels. So now we're going to move into the Gospel of Matthew.